Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Didn't quite finish today's lesson. Covered quite a lot. Hopefully that was useful for you. It's always a bit dry, sort of teaching you constitutional history, but it's a pretty important bedrock for really much of the remainder of the course. It's not just about the next few lessons when we do about Weimar Germany, but it's constitutional history kind of underpins so much of this unit about Germany 1871 to 1990, and it's understanding how lawmaking happens and how government works, government and politics. So what I want to do then is just quickly finish off today's lesson. What we didn't look at is the weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution. So I'll push through quickly, just need to whiz through the slides that we covered today, and then we'll get to where we left off and I'll finish it off. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move myself out of the way there. I'll post that assignment on Wednesday when we get to the lesson where I teach you how to do source skills. Likewise, the Prezi, what I'll try to do is because obviously the lesson was recorded, so I might take that recording and try to sort of like edit it and make it into a self-contained little video, which I'll share with you later. Okay, so focusing on the strengths, so the specific strengths summarised there, and as is explained in a nutshell, it's about sort of hindsight, remembering that it's easy as historians, isn't it, to sort of like look back over the Weimar period, knowing that it's ultimately the Republic did seem to fail because, of course, it resulted in the rise to power of Hitler, who, of course, was, it was obviously a national disaster, Adolf Hitler taking power, and so historians inevitably have explored, well, how come Hitler was able to take power in 1933? And of course the starting point then is, well, what was wrong with the Weimar Constitution that allowed Hitler to become Chancellor in 1933? And so, of course, historians inevitably have focused in on the weaknesses. But as we saw in this morning's lesson, it's really important to sort of understand that there were considerable strengths, not least Article 48, which is traditionally seen as a weakness, was actually used very, very well in the first 4 or 5 years of the Republic to protect it against threats from the extreme left and from the extreme right, which is where we finished off. But also proportional representation has had a bad press. It was well intentioned. And of course we can see its weaknesses now with hindsight, but at the time it was introduced for a good reason. So what we covered in the lesson today is all sort of very important points, that there were considerable strengths. The Bill of Rights, the constitutional guarantees of civil liberties and freedoms were all big improvements on the Second Reich's constitution. So that's important, because if you do get a question in the examination about the Weimar Constitution, then you do need to put it into context, okay, in terms of not just what happened afterwards, which with regards Hitler taking power, which tends to sort of like shed a light on its weaknesses, but if you compare it with what was there before, in other words, the Second Reich Constitution, it obviously had considerable strengths. Anyway, we're now talking about the weaknesses. So here we've got the in a nutshell slide, and we'll just sort of go through the sort of key points here. So, on the other hand, again, there's that word again, our hindsight as historians. Okay, that's an important word, especially by looking at the rise to power of the Nazis. We can see that the Weimar Constitution was deeply flawed. There were problems, okay? So the voting system is the first one we'll look at. It's called proportional representation, okay? on the surface, it was a very fair voting system, but it had three weaknesses. Okay, and those three weaknesses. Firstly, it meant that most governments had to be coalition governments. Okay, which required several parties to work together in government, after which they were often unable to do. As I said, if the SPD, for example, had 38% of the vote, and therefore it got 38% of the seats. Okay, so it was very, as a result, for a party to get a majority of the seats in the Reichstag, it has to get a majority of the vote. In other words, it's got to get at least 51% of the national vote. And that's a pretty tough call. Now, there is another election system, and it's the one we have in Britain today, which is called the first past the post election system. And we'll come on to that in a minute. And when I explain how that works, you will perhaps understand why proportional representation has got its weaknesses, although likewise, first past the post voting system has got its critics as well. Okay, so we'll look at that. Secondly, the voting system proportional representation meant that extreme anti-republican parties on the far left and far right were able to get some seats in Parliament, which gave them greater leverage in debates than they deserved. It gave them a platform to promote their anti-republican views, which increased their influence and weakened the republic. So a classic example of that is in 1928, in May 1928, there were Reichstag elections, and a small fringe political party called the Nazi Party achieved 2.6% of the national vote. Okay, that's a tiny proportion. That's only basically 5 people out of every 200 voted for the Nazi Party. Okay, 2.6%. But proportional representation, being a very fair system, said therefore the Nazis were allowed to have 2.6% of the seats in the Reichstag. Okay, now there were several hundred seats in the Reichstag, but 2.6% meant the Nazis got 12 seats. Now, it's not very many, it's a tiny number of seats in a big voting chamber of several hundred, but at least it got them into the Reichstag, and it gave them a position where they could use their just 12 seats to kind of like influence the debate, which often would be very disruptive and heckling and asking awkward questions, etc., etc. Okay, now the other voting system, the one we have, for example, in Britain today, called first past the post, basically has got built-in mechanisms so that small little parties, okay, that only get 2.6% of the vote, don't get any seats in Parliament. Now, you could argue that's very unfair, okay, but likewise, there is a counter-argument that it prevents the sort of like radical fringe parties from having an unnecessary influence in our procedures. Okay, so different points of view. But as historians, it's not really a question of having a point of view, it's just a question of understanding what happened in the past. Okay. Thirdly, the voting system was based on lists of candidates, also distanced voters from politics and made them feel less involved in politics. So we'll come on to that one in a minute when we look at the detail. There were other weaknesses. Okay, so the Article 48, it strengthened the powers of the president, and of course it worked well if the president was in support of the republic. Okay, now Hebert, the first president, was very pro-republican. As you know, he was a moderate leader of the Social Democrats, okay, but his views were very much sort of towards the centre of politics. So he believed in the democratic process, okay. So he used Article 48 to defend democracy, to make democracy work. So when there were threats from the extremists, the Kaputsch, or the Communist Party, particularly the Communist Party, he used the powers of Article 48 to call upon the army to put down those threats. Okay, but it worked the opposite way if the president was not a supporter of the Republic. Now, in 1925, our old friend, remember Paul von Hindenburg, the general, the war hero from World War One, who was part of that duo, the silent dictators in the second half of World War One, along with Hindenburg. Okay, he was actually elected as president of the Republic, as the figurehead of the sort of like figurehead at the top of the Republic. But at heart, Hindenburg was not really a supporter of the Republic. He was obviously a monarchist. He was a man from the days of the Kaiser, and the the big argument, which we'll explore in much more detail, is that he, in a sense, was able to use his position, and he was able to use that Article 48. Remember, the president had the power to step in and to pass laws and to use his decision. If the Reichstag was not able to pass laws, then the president could make laws by presidential decree. And that's what Article 48 said. And Hindenburg basically was able to use that from in the early 1930s. I mean, basically between 1930 and 32, nearly every single law that was passed in the Weimar Republic was passed by presidential decree. The Reichstag effectively was not used in the lawmaking procedure because they could not find any governments that were able to work, any parties that were able to work together in a coalition government. So lawmaking therefore fell to the president, and the president, because he ultimately did not really support the Republic, ultimately that did not work in favour of the Republic, which is one of the reasons that Hitler was able to take power. Okay, and then finally, another really important point that we'll look at is it goes back to that famous pact, the telephone call, the Berg Pact of November the 10th, 1918. Because remember, what that did is it basically guaranteed that the machinery of the state, okay, the judiciary, the civil service, and especially the army, the Reichswehr, whose job it was to make the constitution work, was controlled by those old elites, people like Paul von Hindenburg and the Prussian Junkers, whose attitude at best was only lukewarm towards the Republic, and at worst was very, very anti-Republican. Okay, so that was another sort of fundamental weakness of the Weimar Constitution. So we'll pick that a little bit now. Okay, so proportional representation. Yeah, this is an interesting one. So the system, as we said, ensured that no one party was able to achieve a majority. ... That means because a large number of parties were elected, every Weimar government had to be made up of a coalition. Okay, so as I said, if you have a system where it says that a party gets 3% of the vote, has to get 3% of the seats. Okay, inevitably, therefore, you're going to get lots and lots of parties with some seats in Parliament. Okay, because all the seats have got to be divided out by proportion of the proportion of votes that they get in the national elections. So as long as a political party gets just a small proportion of the votes, they're going to get probably 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 small numbers of seats in Parliament. So what happened in the Reichstag was that there were lots of political parties in the arena, and most of them only had a small number of seats. Okay, so what that inevitably meant was that the biggest parties, it was difficult for them to really have an overall majority because the total number of seats was spread thinly over lots of parties. So as I say, the SPD in the Weimar Republic in the first election, it was the largest party. It won more votes than any other party, but it was only able to get 38%. It wasn't able to get a majority of the national vote. And therefore it was only given 38% of the seats in the Reichstag. And therefore, to govern, it had to form a coalition. Okay? Now, that's in contrast to the British system. Now, the British system, I've just demonstrated it here by a very, very simplistic sort of idea. And it's almost like saying, I've reduced it down to sort of a simple notion, okay? But the British system is based on what we call constituencies. So the country, the UK, is divided into regions, and the regions are called constituency. Now, I think in Britain it's something like 635, something like that, constituencies. And what happens is within that particular geographical region, okay, so let's just take, I don't know, let's just pick let's just pick a region randomly. Let's just say, okay, Maidstone, okay. So the people of Maidstone will vote for however many political parties stand in the election, okay, and for that particular region. So, but there are 600 odd regions in Britain. So, and whoever wins the vote, whichever candidate wins the vote for that region, goes to Parliament and becomes the MP, the Member of Parliament for that particular region. So you've got 635 members of Parliament. Okay, so we'll reduce that simplistically down to this sort of idea here. Here's a very simple country, but it only has 4 regions. Okay, and it's got 3 political parties. So 3 candidates standing in each of the 4 regions. So in region 1, okay, Party A gets 45% of the vote. Okay, they add up to 100%. Okay, so the candidate for Party A therefore wins, and that candidate gets a seat. In Parliament. Party A 1 seat. Okay, then in region 2, Party A gets 55% of the vote. Party B only gets 15%. Party C gets 30%. Adds up to 100%. So Party A sends a member to Parliament. Okay, so Party A now has got 2 members in Parliament. And then region 3, actually Party B, that did really badly in region 2, Party B storms it in region 3 and gets 75% of the vote. Okay, Party A, that won in region 1 and 2, doesn't do really well. It doesn't get many of the votes in region 3 and gets 5%. Party C gets 20%. Okay, that's your 100%. Party B, therefore, sends a member to Parliament. Okay, and then region 4, Party A just gets it. Okay, 35% of the vote. Okay, just pips Party B to the post. Okay, they get 34%. Party C, pretty narrow race in region 4. Party C gets 31%. Okay, better than they've done in any of the other regions. So Party A therefore sends a member to Parliament. Okay, so therefore add it up. Party A has 3 seats. Party B has 1 seat. It's a very small Parliament. Okay, because there's only 4 regions. As I say, you've got to imagine in a typical country it'd be many, many more than that. It'd be literally hundreds of seats, okay? But just reducing it to a simple equation. So therefore, Party B is the government. So no, Party A is the government because they've got 3 seats, okay? So is this fair? Okay? Because you actually take the average vote over on the right. Okay, Party A, if you average all those votes up, 45 plus 55 plus 5 plus 35 divided by 4, the average vote for Party A was 35%. Party B, the average vote was 40%. Party C, the average vote was 25%. Now, Party B, therefore, has across the whole of the country a greater share of the votes than any other party. And yet in Parliament, Party B has only got 1 seat. Party A has 3 seats. But Party A has only got 35%. Okay, see what I mean? The other thing is Party C could feel pretty aggrieved because they've actually on average got 25% of the vote across the whole country. 25% of the vote, there are 4 seats. So therefore, what's 25% of 4 seats? They should have 1 seat. But they don't have any because they did not win any of the regions. So they have no representation in Parliament even though they got a quarter of the vote. Okay, so is that fair? Party A, 3 seats with 35% of the vote. Party B, only 1 seat with 40% of the vote. What's going on there? Party C, no seats with 25% of the vote. The argument is Party B really should be the governing party, and yet Party B is the opposition party. Okay, Party C, well, okay, they certainly don't deserve to be the governing party, but surely they arguably deserve to have one seat out of the four. Okay, so that's kind of like that's in a simplistic way the way the British system works. That's what we call the first past the post system. Okay, that we have in Britain. Okay, and if you are a supporter of proportional representation, you would argue that that is not fair. You would say that's fundamentally wrong. Okay, if you believed in proportional representation. But okay, as I say, the problem that we have with the proportional representation system is if you basically distributed the seats that way, yeah, so that Party B gets 40% of the seats and Party A then gets 35% of the seats and Party C gets 25% of the seats, then there's no party in Parliament that has a majority of the seats. So therefore, Party B, because it's the largest party, would be invited to form a cabinet, to form a government, but Party B would then have to look at, well, hold it, to get the 50% of the seats to pass laws, I will have to coalesce with either Party C or with Party A. I'll have to approach the leader of one of those two parties and negotiate with them, and then in return give them some of the places in my cabinet so that I get the 50%. Now, the advantage of the British pass the post system is it does result in one party, okay, which in this case would be Party A, getting a majority, because Party A would have 3 out of the 4 seats. They would have a majority. Party A would be able to pass laws. Okay, so neither system is perfect. Both have got flaws. That's not really what this is about, as I say. This is history. It's not politics. It's not really our place to sort of judge in terms of what our views are today. It's more to look at the impact of this system in terms of history. Okay, so hopefully that's that makes that reasonably clear. So there's a reminder of our political spectrum, and as I put there, note in the 1920s there were many radical parties on the far right wing that wanted to overthrow the Republic, but the one that emerged as the leading far right party was a party called the NSDAP, also known as the National Socialists or the Nazi Party. Okay, so we now need to be increasingly mindful of that particular party there. Okay, because what we're saying is proportional representation, which is the system that existed with the Weimar Constitution, enabled the Nazi Party to get a foothold in the Reichstag. Okay, it didn't start until 1928 when the Nazis got 2.6% of the vote, but because they got 2.6% of the vote, they were able to get 2.6% of the seats, which was 12 seats. Okay, now if the British first past the post system existed, think of Party C in the diagram we just looked at, okay, then basically the Nazi Party would not have been able to get a foothold in Parliament. They would not have got any seats. Okay, so in that sense, the Constitution gave them a leverage into political affairs in 1928. Okay, so as I say, because the proportional representation voting system meant that it was very difficult for the biggest party to get more than half the seats, because it was a fair system, inevitably, therefore, governments had to be coalition governments. The Chancellor had to work out other parties to negotiate with other parties to form a government to be able to pass laws through the Reichstag, to get that majority to pass laws. And if those political parties could not hold it together and would disagree with each other, then lawmaking would not be able to work. Okay, simply they would not be able to pass laws because they wouldn't be able to get 50% of the support in the Reichstag. And that became visibly evident as a problem in the Weimar Republic by this diagram, as we've seen. In theory, if coalition governments worked and they stayed together, then there wouldn't be a need to be elections more often than the 4 years, which the Constitution said there had to be an election every 4 years. But because governments fell apart, effectively there had to be regular Reichstag elections to try to reconstitute parties that could work together. And as a result, governments fell apart and new chancellors were appointed, often in astonishingly short periods of time. Okay. You can see here then the names of the chancellors and the political parties that they belong to. And you can also see that although the Social Democratic Party were the majority party, the largest party for much of the history of the Weimar Republic, with the exception of Hermann Müller briefly in the end of the late 1920s, noticed that the Social Democrats did not form a government, okay, for much of the Weimar Republic, even though they were the largest party. And that's because other political parties, well, they were not able to work with other political parties. So the president had to step in and approach other political leaders to take on the position of chancellor to try to form majorities instead. In actual fact, the Social Democratic Party preferred to be a party in opposition than to sort of like stick their head above the parapet and become the party of government, okay, for much of the period, which was a particular problem. Okay. Put this one in, it was actually from the 2 years ago we had a general election in the UK, and it's just sort of demonstrating in a sense, this is from the BBC website, okay, you click on the link and read the article, the British first past the post system, how it actually sort of like works, okay, and it kind of exemplifies that. So in the 2019 UK general election, the Conservative Party achieved 43% of the vote. Okay, so you can see that figure there, or 44% of the vote. Okay, so they did not get an overall majority. Labour 32%, Liberal Democrats 11%, and then various smaller parties. Okay, but because of our voting system, it's based on constituencies where each region returns a member of parliament. Effectively, the Conservative Party, although they got only 44% of the vote, they got 364 of the seats. So they had an overall majority because there were 649 seats in our parliament, and 364 out of 649 meant the Conservatives got 56% of the seats, even though they only had 43% of the vote. So it kind of like exemplifies first past the post system. Okay. Now, if we'd had proportional representation, the Conservatives would have only had 44% of 649 seats, so they would have got far fewer seats than the 364. But our system at least meant, therefore, that one party was capable of governing by itself, which is therefore going to make it less likely that governments will fall apart, okay, because there was no need for coalition governments. But let's say it's all a question of political viewpoint there, and that's not really what this is about. We're historians, okay. Now, the other weakness of this, of proportional representation, is, again, it kind of comes back to our political system, okay? Our voting system. In the UK, we have British first past the post. So I'll avoid using the names of actual MPs. So, but goes back to that sort of earlier model. Region 1, okay? Region 1, whatever it is. We would call it a constituency. It could be a town. everybody in that region votes for Party A, Party B, and Party C. And Party A gets 45% of the vote, Party B gets 35%, etc. And therefore the candidate from Party A is sent by that constituency, by the people of that region, to Parliament. Okay? But that voting process arguably is a good process because the Member of Parliament represents Region A, the people of Region A. And the people of Region A will know who your Member of Parliament is, okay? Because that person, he or she, is from your town. They campaigned in your town, they've gone knocking on the doors, and you know who your Member of Parliament is. You may not agree with them, you may not have voted for them, but it is somebody who you actually know, okay? So the first past the post system that we have, for example, in Britain, means that the politicians who are in Westminster, okay, are close to the people who voted for them because they actually came from that particular region. Okay. Now, proportional representation system used in Weimar Germany was very, very different. Okay. As explained there, Reichstag members did not run for election directly. Instead, they were selected by their parties after it was apparent how many seats that party had achieved in the election. So, remember, it was like one member of parliament for every 60,000 voters. Okay, so after an election, they would count up the number of votes that party had achieved, and they would say, right, that party therefore will return to Parliament, I don't know, sort of like 134 seats in the Reichstag will be given to that political party. And they would have a list of all the members of that political party, and they would work their way down the list and draw a line after the 138th person, and they say all those people now have got seats in the Reichstag. But the voters, the people who actually voted for that party, wouldn't really know who their representatives were because they were just simply taken from a central list. Okay, so that's what we mean by distancing, okay, the sort of distancing effect. There was a considerable distance between the voting public and the politicians that represented them. So that's one of the flaws, okay. These flaws in the Constitution meant that irresponsible individuals and political parties had considerable potential to undermine democracy. So again, that's a sort of another point. So for example, Adolf Hitler. In 1928, the Nazi Party achieved 2.6% of the votes. They got 12 seats in Parliament, and although they were only a very tiny party, they were able to heckle and disrupt proceedings in Parliament. Okay, and that's something Hitler was able to utilise to undermine democratic process. I mean, a Parliament is supposed to be a fair, balanced voting chamber. Okay, but if you've got sort of like radical groups in there, they can disrupt the sort of like process. Okay, which is basically what happened. The next one, I think we've already kind of like explained, haven't we? That if you've got a fair-minded, sort of fairly objective, balanced president who believes in democracy, who wanted democracy to work, who wanted there to be fair, balanced debate in the voting chambers, etc., then that was good, okay? And he used Article 48 well. Remember, Article 48 gave him the power to step in and to pass emergency decrees if necessary. And he used those powers, the power to tell the army to step in and to remove extremist groups that threatened the Republic, that perhaps wanted to march on the capital city and overthrow it violently. He used those powers to ensure that the Republic was protected. Okay, but then in 1925 Hebert died and a new president, Hindenburg, was elected. Okay, and as I say, at heart he was actually a monarchist. He genuinely didn't believe that Germany should be a republic. He was born and bred and in the days of the Kaiserreich, he at heart believed that Germany should have a monarch at the top, like an emperor. So he was actually no coincidence. He was nicknamed the Ersatz-Kaiser, okay, which basically means a substitute Kaiser. So remember, a president, an elected president, is the head of state. Well, the Kaiser was a monarch who was the head of state. And he was so kind of like in favour of monarchy as the new head of state from 1925 that he basically was given the nickname that he is really almost like an emperor, okay, because he was a monarchist at heart as head of state. And more than that, he used those powers, particularly Article 48, that were given to him to pass emergency decrees to undermine the Republic. And that was especially the case between 1929 and 33, when Germany was hit by the Great Depression. Okay, and that's something we'll look at later. And then the final weakness is this, okay, the political establishment, as we've already talked about. Remember the Berg Pact, phone call of 10th of November 1918. And that was the deal, wasn't it? That Hebert, to ensure his political survival, turned his back on his own brothers in a sense, okay? The USPD and the Spartacists, like Hebert, were Marxists. They believed that power should be given to the working classes. But Hebert was not prepared to tolerate the methods that they were prepared to use, which is the method of political violence, of revolution to achieve power for the workers. He wasn't prepared to accept that. He believed that democracy, that doing it properly through voting was the right way to manage the political affairs of the country. And so he chose to cut himself off from other socialists, from the socialists on the far left. And he, therefore, to ensure that what he wanted to happen happened, turned to the right wing, the generals, the army. And, of course, the army utilised the extreme right wing, the Freikorps, okay? And they were used to crush the revolutionary left. But the deal was, and that's the conversation that happened between them, is Hebert says, I want you guys to protect me, to put down the political left. And Groener said, well, I'm prepared to do that, but if we're going to put up with a republic, which we don't really like, but I don't, Groener said, he would rather keep the Kaiser, but okay, fair enough. There was no choice. The Kaiser and the monarchs had to go, but he basically said in return that from anywhere else in the pyramid going down, where the elites have got top jobs, in particular the judiciary, the civil service, and particularly the jobs I've got, which is to command the army, we, the upper classes, want to keep our jobs. Okay, so the point is the political establishment, the fixed machinery that was responsible for making sure that the Republic would work, to backing up and to enforcing the law. So their job is to serve the elected politicians like Hebert, to implement the laws of the Republic. Their jobs didn't change. So whenever there was an election, governments came and went, but the people in the civil service, the army, the judiciary, the educational system, the universities continued. And those people were on the whole the old Prussian elites, the old upper classes, the old elites. And that was the deal made between Hebert and Groener, the Hebert-Groener Pact. And what that basically meant was that Hebert, the president of the Republic, was reliant on the establishment from the Kaiserreich, from the old empire, to lay the foundations of stable government. And as a result, the higher levels of the army, civil service and the judges, the people whose job it was to protect the Republic and to support it, actually they despised the Republic. Their support was lukewarm at best. Okay, and as the years passed, at worst, these people whose job it was to protect and serve the Republic actually used their positions of influence to undermine the Republic and to weaken it. And ultimately, of course, in 1933, that resulted in them putting into power a man called Adolf Hitler, who then actively served these people by dismantling the Weimar Republic and restoring an authoritarian system. Hitler didn't bring back the Kaiser, but nevertheless, these people hoped that he would, and they supported him into power. So Hitler was helped into power by these people. So judges frequently interpreted the law in a manner that allowed violent right-wing fanatics to go free. And if you actually look at the judicial record of the Weimar Republic, in other words, court decisions, when people were put on trial for treason, for, in other words, plotting to overthrow the government using violence, you've got left-wing plotters like the Spartacists, and you've got right-wing plotters. Well, basically, the far right-wing fanatics who plotted to undermine the Republic basically either got very light sentences or they even went free. Okay? And the classic example of that in 1923, Adolf Hitler himself was a very young politician. I mean, he was a revolutionary leader. He wasn't really a politician in the early 1920s. He tried to seize power, tried to overthrow the Republican government violently in 1923, the so-called beer hall putsch, and he was arrested and he went to trial, and he should probably have had a life sentence for what he did, but he basically was put on trial, and the judge at his trial was very sympathetic because his judge was right-wing. Okay, he was nationalistic. The judge despised the Republic. The judge preferred the old system of the Kaiserreich, and therefore Hitler had a very, very sympathetic judge at his trial, and he got scot-free, effectively let out in less than a year. Okay, and that sort of thing was the norm. Okay, and yet there were other cases where left-wing plotters who did far worse, far less than Hitler, got far longer sentences. Okay, so in other words, the system was biased towards the right wing. So the Weimar Republic was undermined by the very institutions that were meant to uphold its laws and to protect its values, is the sort of key point there. Okay, and again, now we're looking at sources in our next lesson, so I won't talk you through those sources, just to remind you that we'll look at how to answer source questions, and then one of the things you need to be doing is going back through your notes, looking at all these sources I put at the end of the class notes, and be thinking about what the value of that source is, what you can learn from it, etc. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully that was useful for you, and have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.